Good morning. This is Ellen at Camden First United Methodist Church. Before I start the lesson for today, I want to tell you that I have been following along in this book right here called Ask, Faith Questions for a Skeptical Age, making sure that you all can see that. I have this week and then next week in that, and then I'm going to start a new series. Now, not all of the books look this pretty. This is by Maxine Dunham, and it's called The Workbook of Living Prayer. I want you to know that if you want to get one of these books, our pastor here at Camden First United Methodist Church has ordered several copies. If you'll get in touch with the office, then she can get a copy to you or arrange for you to pick it up. I will say that you can buy this at many outlets, including Walmart and Amazon and Cokesbury, but I'm going to suggest that you don't get it in an ebook, but rather in the paperback, because it is literally a workbook that you fill out as you're going along if you would like to journey with us as fellow pilgrims working on our prayer life. Now, let me get to the lesson at hand. I guess I'm going to walk away to get rid of this book. So let me see if I can lean over here but still stay in the camera. Now, I don't know. I have a feeling I went out of camera, which is a bad thing to do. But I have been enjoying this series until I picked it up this time and I flipped through. I said, now, what was that lesson about? Lesson 7. Was Jesus' resurrection real? I thought, what kind of a question is that? Why would anybody be listening to a Sunday school lesson? I mean, why would I talk to them about something that to them has to be real? But then I did a little exploring. One of the things I ran across was the fact that there is a lot of skepticism even among people who are Christians, who feel that they are Christians, and I guess they are Christians. There's some skepticism. There was a survey that was done in, let me see here, April of 2017 by BBC News in the United Kingdom, asking people about the resurrection of Jesus Christ and about what they believed about it. The BBC reported that 31% of people who identified themselves as Christian said that they did not believe in life after death. Of those who did believe in life after death, now, going back again to the whole pool of Christians, everybody was surveyed, but I'm just talking about what the Christians said. The people who identified as Christians, of those, 31% said that they believed in the resurrection of Jesus as reported in the Gospels. Now that number rises if you only include the Christians who are active, and by active they said someone who attended church at least once a month. Then you have 57% of Christians believing in the resurrection as it is presented in the Gospels. So obviously there is some skepticism and some doubt. Let me begin by saying I do not believe that doubt is a sin. I do not believe that doubt is wrong. I believe that doubt is a matter of the heart and the mind, and I believe that doubt is normal for the human condition, and I believe that from the beginning we have had doubts about the resurrection, that this is just something that Christians do. They have their doubts. Let me give you a great example from the 28th chapter of Matthew. In this chapter, after Jesus has been raised from the dead, he tells the women, tell my disciples to go to Galilee and meet me there. And so they go to Galilee. And I'm going to begin with verse 16 once I put these wonderful glasses on. Here is what the gospel writer says. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Hear that again. Who is it that's on this mountain? The gospel writer says the 11 disciples. I take that then to mean the 11 apostles. There would be 11 left now that Judas is gone. So it's the apostles themselves who have gone to the mountain to meet Jesus. They are standing in front of the risen Christ, and yet the gospel writer says, yet some doubted. Doubt is natural. Doubt is something that I don't think it just comes one time. It'll come in on us sometimes in waves. And doubt has led to all kinds of explanations and variations on the gospel message. That's one of the reasons that the creeds came into being, to teach people about the faith. But what kind of things would people say, or do people continue to say? Some people suggested, well, maybe Jesus never really died on the cross. Kind of hard to believe if we believe that he was crucified, since it was such a torturous death and since Rome was so efficient at execution. Well, maybe he died, but somebody stole his body. Hey friends, that is a really old story. If you again are reading in the Gospel of Matthew, you will see that the chief priest and others know that the body of Jesus is gone. They're beginning to hear the news of the resurrection, and they don't want people to believe it, so they decide to bribe the Roman soldiers who were there to say that the disciples of Jesus had come and stolen the body. So they're already getting their story straight right then. So that's been a story that's been believed on and off for years. Some thinking that maybe the disciples themselves stole the body so they could create this wonderful story. Others that, well, no, it was someone else who stole the body, but then the disciples just thought they saw Jesus. Now, mind you, that would be mass hallucination. And I say that because in 1 Corinthians, Paul asserts that in addition to the apostles and to Paul, the resurrected Jesus appeared to about 500 people. That's a lot of people to be deluded. And how deluded were these people, or how good of a liar were these people if that's what they were doing? These are people who were willing to literally put their life on the line for this story of a resurrected Jesus. These are people who were cowering, who had run away, who were afraid to be associated with Jesus. Look at Peter. He not only denies that he knows Jesus, he even curses about it, telling people, I told you I don't know the man. And yet, approximately 6 weeks later, on Pentecost, the day that we are celebrating this Sunday, Peter is standing in public, not only declaring that Jesus is the Messiah, but claiming that this Jesus who was crucified has been raised from the dead, and that he, Peter, is a witness. Not only is Peter in danger of being considered a lunatic or a drunk, but he's very much putting himself in danger of being put to death by the Roman authorities, and he knows because he saw it happen to Jesus. Something happened that changed Peter, and I believe that something was the resurrected Jesus that Peter encountered. No, you cannot logically prove to someone who doubts that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, but I do believe that that belief is central to what Christianity teaches. That belief is what fuels and empowers Christianity. The resurrected Jesus appeared to people, and according to the stories in the gospel, he appeared in bodily form. The Gospels are crystal clear about that. In order to understand that Jesus was actually a body, we get such reports as in Luke when Jesus eats fish with the disciples. We see Jesus appearing on the Emmaus Road, and as he walks along with these people these two guys that don't at first recognize him, Jesus stops and breaks bread with them. And breaking bread means not just that he's breaking a loaf of bread, but that he's participating in a meal. And then we'll see Jesus later on in the Gospel of John cooking fish. So obviously Jesus has come in a physical form, in a bodily form. Now, most of the apostles and disciples recognize Jesus as soon as they see him. There's some delay in a few cases. Mary Magdalene, who's going to be the first person in the Gospel of John to encounter the risen Lord, doesn't at first know that this is Jesus. But as soon as he speaks her name, as soon as he says to her, Mary, she knows that this is her risen Lord. The disciples on the road to Emmaus will say later on that their hearts burned within them when they were walking with this man, but they don't immediately recognize he is Jesus, but they do when he breaks bread with them. The others recognize Jesus. They know that he is risen, and they understand, and it can only be from their encounter, that this risen Jesus is different than a resuscitated person. A resuscitated person would be one that seemed to have been dead or was dead and came back to life. An example being Lazarus. Lazarus is raised from the dead by Jesus, but Lazarus and all of the disciples and family members understand that Lazarus is going to die again. But they were able to comprehend with Jesus that this risen body was something different than what had ever been encountered before, that Jesus would never die. This risen body that takes a physical form, that eats fish and appears in the flesh and lets people touch him, also ascends into heaven, which is a mystery that I can't quite understand. But I know that Jesus appeared in bodily form in part so that we would understand that we too will have a risen body. This is what we say in the ancient words of the Creed, that we believe in the resurrection of the body. Now we might say, well, what in the world is this body going to be like? I don't quite comprehend. That's okay, because it's a difficult concept to comprehend. You know what I did? I left my Bible over there out of reach, so I'm probably going to maybe step out of the camera. If so, I'm just going to be waving at you while I do so that you don't notice that I'm gone. Whoops, forgot to wave. Sorry. I think I left my glasses over there too, so this gets worse and worse. But I'm going to read to you, I hope, from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul talks about what's this risen body going to be like that we're going to get. And let me get this out here where I can see, since I don't have my glasses on. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, I'm starting with verse 35, but someone will say, well, how are the dead raised? What kind of body will they have when they come back? Look, fool, when you put a seed in the ground, it doesn't come back to life unless it dies. What you put in the ground doesn't have the shape of what it will be, but it is a bare grain of wheat or some other kind of seed. God gives it the sort of shape that he chooses, and he gives each of the seed its own shape. So I'm going to pause on Paul there for a minute and say, yeah, that makes sense, that we can't quite comprehend what this resurrected body will be like. It will be a resurrected body, but not in the form that we're accustomed to. It will be something different. Just as if I put, he's talking about wheat, I don't grow a lot of wheat, but if I put a pea seed in the ground, the plant that comes up and even the pods in which the pea is, they look a lot different than the pea itself. He'll go on to say in the 42nd verse, it is the same with the resurrection of the dead. A rotting body is put into the ground, but what is raised won't ever decay. It is degraded when it is put into the ground, but it is raised in glory. It is weak when it is put into the ground, but it is raised in power. It is a physical body when it is put into the ground, but it is raised as a spiritual body. My friends, one of the effects of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is that you and I are assured that we too will become a resurrected body someday, that there is life beyond this life. Let's talk a little bit more about the power and the importance of the resurrection. What if we believe that Jesus was a wonderful teacher, that all the things he taught were wonderful, that his way of life is probably the best way of life, but when he died on the cross, sorry folks, that's all there was. It makes a difference, because the resurrection says something different to us. If Jesus simply died on the cross and that's all there was, then this is a great tragedy, a very sad story. More than likely, to be honest, I don't think we'd even be talking about it, because there were other people who claimed the mantle of messiahship and were put to death and forgotten about. As a matter of fact, if you read in chapter, I believe it's chapter 4 of Acts, you'll see that the Jewish leaders, when they come together and they're discussing what to do with Peter and Paul and these people who are pronouncing the resurrection of Jesus, one of them says, you know, the other people that came along that called themselves Messiah and were put to death, their followers soon dissipated. So that's what's going to happen here. And obviously, as we can see, a good 2,000 years later, that did not happen. But instead, the powerful story of the resurrection has been a power that has changed lives for generations, hundreds of generations. So the resurrection is a vindication of Jesus Christ. Remember that Jesus is put to death as someone who is either a criminal or a lunatic or a rebel or a liar. He's got to be one of those things, according to those who are putting him to death. But the resurrection of Jesus is a vindication of all that Jesus has taught. It is God's assurance that Jesus had the authority of God when he spoke. And that means that everything that Jesus tells us in the gospel is true and to be believed. So Jesus, when he teaches us about grace, when he calls to us and tells us about the love of God, when he puts forward a way of life that says that the way is to be of peace and of love and of self-sacrifice, of emptying yourself, the way of the cross, Jesus has absolute authority from God when he says those things, and we can know them to be true. And that's what the resurrection power does for us. The bodily resurrection of Jesus also affirms that God cares about us individually and that God cares about our bodies. In order to follow Jesus, we don't have to give up our humanity. We don't have to deny our humanity, because God affirms that God's creation is good and that God longs to restore his creation to the beauty that it once had. I'm going to read you a quotation I got from a blog by a Mennonite pastor named Michael Paul, P-A-H-L. This is what he says. Salvation, then, is not some kind of a disembodied ideal. Salvation is not about escaping our bodies and flying up and away from the world and living eternally as spiritual beings somewhere up in heaven. Jesus' resurrection affirms that God's desire in salvation is to transform us and our world, restoring humanity and creation to God's original intention, all things experiencing justice and peace and flourishing like heaven come down to earth. What does the resurrection of Jesus mean for us? I believe, among other things, it believes that we have new life now and new life in the life to come. That it teaches us that God is with us now, God is with us in life, God goes with us through death, and God goes with us into life beyond death. Jesus, earlier in his story, when, it was just before he raises Lazarus from the dead, he tells Martha, I am the resurrection and the life, and everyone who believes in me, though they die, they will live. I am the resurrection and the life, says Jesus. And he goes on to say that everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. That's what the resurrection assures us of, that we live now and we will live ever. It doesn't mean that we only go about, and I've said this before, we don't only go about making it our only goal. Hey, I'm going to go to heaven and I'm going to be good because I want to go to heaven. That is something we can look forward to. It is something that can give us hope, and it is something that comforts us when we lose someone we love. But more than that, we live the resurrection now. When Jesus was talking to Martha, and remember, Jesus has not yet been put to death. Jesus has not yet been raised from the dead. He nevertheless says to Martha, I am the resurrection. He doesn't say, I will be the resurrection. He says, I am the resurrection. To me, that means that it's not only the life to come, but it is life now. It is life abundant. It is life full. It is life lived out in God's love and God's grace as God intended for it to be. So just to give an example, and I could give many, of the resurrection power that we see all around us, I'm going to give a story that is a little old. I could have gotten a newer one, but I like this. There was a man in the early 20th century in Japan. His name was Tashiki Ishii. I tried to say that 3 times. But Ishii was a very hardened criminal. He will tell in a little biography he wrote about how one crime led to another, how he hated humanity, how he hated himself, and eventually I believe he commits a murder. So he's in prison awaiting execution. The food was absolutely terrible in this prison. And it so happened that some Christian missionaries would come, and if they could go in to see the prisoner, they were allowed to take food with them, and then they would preach to the prisoner. So he would let the missionaries come in, not, he said, because he wanted to hear what they had to say, because he despised them, and he was very rude to them. But because they brought in food, he'd allow them, he'd tolerate them in there because he wanted that food. Well, one day some women missionaries tried to give him a Bible, and he wouldn't take it, so they just dropped it in his cell. He kicked it to the other side of the cell with no intention of ever looking at it. But he said he just got bored. He was in a little 9-by-6 cell, and he just got bored. So he finally picked it up and started reading, and he kept reading. And he said when he came to the words in the gospel where Jesus says, as Jesus is on the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Ishi said that he was struck to the core, that something happened within him, that at that very moment he understood that Jesus, who was dying, was forgiving those who had hurt him. He understood that Jesus really was the way, the truth, and the life. Ishi understood at that moment, God actually loves me. Jesus actually prays for my forgiveness as well as for everybody else's. And this hardened man became a Christian. He would write, as he was awaiting his execution, that his life was completely changed. He said he sat in a little cell 9 feet by 6 feet, eating coarse food, and he said, even as I am living in this little cell, even as I am eating this really bad food, I am more alive and more at peace and more happy now than I ever was in all the days that I could walk around outside the cell a supposedly free man, because I have been changed by Jesus Christ. He went on to say that he knew that God would take him after he died, and he knew that he could trust in the resurrection power and love of Jesus. I'm trying to find his exact statement here if you see me looking about. But listen to this. Ichi was dead in his sins. Ichi lived in a world of utter darkness, despair, despondency, and hatred. And because of the resurrection power of Jesus Christ, he came to know light and love and joy and grace. That is the power of Jesus Christ, because his resurrection is a vindication that God's way is the right way, that all the powers of the world that call us to be angry with each other, that call us to attack the people that we don't like, that call us to get in our little club and our little group and then attack all the rest of them. This is God's message that that's not the way. The way is the way of love and grace. Jesus has put to death the ways of the world. Jesus has put to death sin and death. He's had a victory over those for our sake, so that we can become like Ichi, walking in the newness of life. Here's what Ichi says. He said, I was living in a state of death, and then by the power of that one word of Christ, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing, my unspeakably hardened heart was changed, and I repented of all my crimes. Such power is not in a man. No, such power is not in a man. But such power is in the resurrected Jesus. I am hoping that you can live into that power. I want to go back and say one more thing about doubt. Do not beat yourself up if you find yourself having doubt. I don't know what stage you're in right now as you're listening to me. You may have never believed, you may be slipping from your belief. But as one of the young pastors said, live as if you believe that Jesus is the Christ. Live as if you believe that Jesus has been resurrected, and you may find that you come to believe. As he said, it's okay to have doubt, but lean into it and just lean into Jesus and begin to follow him. And see if you don't, like Ichi, come to know and to love and to accept the risen love of Jesus Christ. May God be with each of you this Pentecost Sunday. In his holy name we pray. Amen.